It's all been misstapled for you. This is a brand new one. I'm going to say a few comments to wrap up the lesson from last week about World War II up here on the board. And then I think we're getting close to finishing out the class. We'll do this week and next week, maybe a third. But now that I'm going to start off with World War II, we're kind of in the time period that many of us were, well, Dad, you were born in what, 1950?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
I was born in the Truman administration.
Anybody born earlier than 50? What? Oh. In the 40s. Yeah, in the 40s. I was born in 77. Isn't that sweet? So I'll see if we can get to World War II, if we can get all the way up to the 70s, then I'll be doing good on this lesson. This is the last lesson in the class. So it's just a question of how many, 2 weeks and maybe 3 to get through it, and then we're off to Ezekiel. But there may be a little more conversation in this particular series because we're going to be talking about events that have happened and are still happening in our own lifetime. And I am by no means an expert on these events. I've studied them, I've read about them, and I know a few things about them, but they're complicated. So a few things just to kind of pick up where we left off, and I have it up here on the board. In the late 19th century, you have the building of vast empires, sometimes called the New Imperialism, especially Great Britain. And this is broken up over the course of 2 world wars. The most important event in World War I, at least for this class, is the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. That Ottoman Empire which ruled over the Turks, began as far back as the High Middle Ages and was the most powerful unifying force in Islam throughout the Middle Ages into the modern period. It was an extremely oppressive group, as we have seen in the High Middle Ages. The Turks, over the course of 3 centuries, in the course of their conquest, killed over 80 million people. And by the time we get to the Ottomans, as we saw in World War I, the atrocities against minorities, we always talk about World War II, but these things took place in the Ottoman Empire in World War I, certainly most notoriously against the Armenians, in the millions. And there have been some studies to suggest that Germany and other oppressive regimes in World War II borrowed some of their techniques from the Ottoman Empire when it came to getting rid of minority people groups. So for me at least, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire is not something I feel really sad about. What happens, though, is you have these splinter states. So once a massive empire collapses, all of the little groups that it dominated are now separated off, and they have to fend for themselves and create a new state of their own. This is the period during which we talked about local freedom fighters. They're called the Mujahideen. Prophets proclaiming a new era for Islam now that they were out from Ottoman control. And at least 3 individuals who claimed to be the Mahdi that was going to reunite the whole Muslim people into a single body. So you can see the collapse of the Ottomans stirred powerful forces in Islam. But today we're going to pick up with a little bit about World War II. I'll see if there's any questions. I'm not going to do a lesson on World War II in general. I'm assuming you know a little bit about it from what you studied in school and watching the History Channel. That's an old joke. Anytime you watch the History Channel, 9 times out of 10, it's about Hitler for some reason. These are the dates. World War II, remember, now Islam is divided up into all these little states. So some of them Iraq, for example, sides with the Axis powers. Some of them side with the Allies. Most Muslim states remain neutral, and like every good state, declared whose side they're on after the war is over. Important, though, Arabia, which is already a very important state after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, now becomes the unquestioned leader in Muslim affairs. Right before the outbreak of the war, one of the richest oil reserves in the whole world is discovered in Arabia. Western powers then give Arabia the resources that they need to mass produce their new oil reserves. And so some of you had observed in earlier classes, isn't it interesting that Arabia and the West have been allies? That begins right around this time period. And Arabia is one of the few states that declares itself for the Allies 100% throughout World War II. And that is a political, economic relationship that will continue from that time point forward. Let me stop and see if there's any questions or comments about that, if some of you might know a little bit about. Everybody knows where Arabia is. Everybody knows they have oil reserves. Everybody knows that they have been allies of the West for a long, long time. And that begins right around this time period. The world then, post-World War II, divides up into Western democratic states, Eastern communist states. And so that's the beginning of the Cold War, this battle for which form of government and culture is going to dominate the globe. Most of the Muslim countries are in this uncomfortable third part that starts to become called the Third World. So we've heard about that, the Third World, but most of the Third World is just Muslim countries. And an important thing that also happens after World War II is the beginning of decolonization, so a kind of reverse of the new imperialism. Western powers start pulling out. There's a general feeling that colonial control of so much of the globe is at least a big part of what contributed to the outbreak of the two world wars. Now that nuclear weapons are on the stage, there's certainly a fear of nuclear weapons. And so as Western powers decolonize, many of these smaller states become independent. So, for example, Libya becomes independent, was previously under colonial control. Indonesia becomes independent, previously a colony. India not only becomes independent, but is split. And a part of India is portioned off and called Pakistan. And there you have probably the biggest mass migration in modern history, at least 14.5 million migrants after the split of India. And Gandhi, who's a well-known person, is part of the story of what goes on in India during that time period. New states then are formed. Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon in the Middle East are sliced up. So one of the things you do after any major war is you rewrite the map because everything has changed, and so now the map needs to be rewritten. Arabia is now the most powerful of the young Muslim states post-World War II, and now the wealthiest. And Arabia is a little bit more conservative Muslim because it's still a kingdom. Most of these Muslim states are choosing between democratic, communist forms of government. Arabia and a few small other countries are still kingdoms in the old sense of the word. And that's important because that enables them to control from a single monarch the religion, the politics, the economics of their country. And they actually start a group called the Arab League. So once Arabia emerges as, post-World War II, the leader of the Muslim states, they begin drawing other Muslim states into a league to try to create some cooperation and some unity among them. Prior to discovering all of that oil, the main source of Arabia's income was pilgrims going to Mecca. So that's a big boost, just in terms of wealth. And of course, this is where we ended, I think, last week. I wrote the word Palestine here. The Levant, that is to say the Holy Land, is partitioned into two states, one of which is called Palestine, one of which is called Israel. So that part of the world gets divided up, and there will be war between Israelis and Palestinians from that time until now. Probably in today's class, we'll get to the point where we can discuss the origin of Hamas, where it came from and how it came into being, because that's certainly in the news now. But let me stop there, because that's all I'm going to really say about World War II is what I have up here on the board, and then I'm going to jump into this lesson, see if there's any thoughts or questions about all of that. I'm not going to talk about Mussolini or Hitler or Stalin. They'll come up periodically, but did you want to talk about them? Yeah.
So is it the collapse of the Ottoman Empire that leads to for the most part, was that the main cause of the creation of these new Muslim states, small Muslim states?
That is the main cause. Now, the Ottoman Empire didn't have everybody, but it had most of the Islamic world. And so the breaking up of the Ottoman Empire creates, I'd say there's two main causes. The breakup of the Ottoman Empire creates these little splinter territories. And then after World War II, the decolonization that happens by Britain and other Western powers creates a kind of power vacuum in which new Muslim states are going to come into being. And when they do come into being, they're going to have to decide what form of government they want. In a very different world than the one that Muhammad began all this business with back in the 7th century. Will they become a socialist government? Will they become a democratic government? Will they be a mixture? Will they try to be a kingdom after the old kind of medieval pattern of government? And any time a Muslim state does that, there's huge conflict. Some Muslim leaders, not Muslim leaders, some Muslim people would regard their leader as about as Muslim as Joe Biden is Catholic. I mean, he might be Muslim in name, but they think of them as politicians. And so there will be uprisings within Muslim states, often led by clerics or religious leaders who are trying to overthrow the government. So there's a tremendous amount of political turmoil in these new states that are growing up. Because there's religious and political turmoil as people fight for control of the government.
These new states are located in areas which were previously occupied by the Ottoman Empire.
Most of them, yeah. Some of them are simply carved out and turned into new states where no state existed before then. Some of them are newly independent. They used to be a colony, like Libya or Indonesia or India, and now they're independent. Or in the case of India, sometimes it becomes independent and it gets carved up into two states. And so, whereas you had one state, now you have two. And so it's a very, very complicated scenario out of which so much that is going on in the Middle East has continued up to the present day. So what I've called this lesson is the Muslim Cold War, because we're all familiar with the Cold War between the two great powers, the West and Russia. But in the Third World, there is Cold War might not be the right word for it. It was pretty bloody. But an ongoing war for what kind of government these new Muslim states are going to have. That's really what the war is about. Yeah. All right, so if I'm looking on the first page of the new lesson here, that's not bad. World War II in 15 minutes. That'd be a good name for a YouTube video. World War II in 15 minutes. Skip down the second paragraph here. Decolonization, state building. I mentioned a statistic here. After World War II, right now we have about 15 Muslim states. It's going to rise to over 50 in the latter half of the 20th century. So that's a lot of new states in a half a century. 15 to 50 new states. Are the governments going to be secular? Are they going to be religious? Are they going to be capitalist? Are they going to be socialist? And so I call that the Muslim Cold War. Another major issue that I footnoted here is what I call the spiritual decadence of the West. But as Western nations, America and Britain especially, become increasingly technological and increasingly materially prosperous, there is a widespread feeling that they've lost their identity, that they no longer really know who they are or what they stand for. Broadly, we continue to argue for freedom, for human freedom and human values. But of course, the idea behind the democratic republic was that people might be free to pursue, in good conscience, higher things. Freedom for religion, as opposed to freedom from religion. And of course, one of the things that's happening now is that as the West loses any clear sense of its identity, political, religious, or moral, Muslim powers that's a weapon. Many of these Muslim states do have an identity. They have an idea of who they are, what they believe in, how they want to live, and they're willing to fight for it. And that has put Western powers has made them very vulnerable to an aggressive enemy that they don't have the, what's a good word for this? What don't they have? They don't have anything to fight for that they believe in much anymore. And the Muslims have things that they fight for that they believe in. I won't say that's true of all Western people. That's a general sense that the West is in a time of internal decay. In any great civilization, they will always say, falls apart inwardly before it's conquered outwardly. And that's probably something we're witnessing in our time. However, Saudi Arabia, I mentioned, is the... so what are these 15 states? I'll rattle through them real quick here. Saudis are the strongest. A few small kingdoms in Yemen and Oman, also in the Saudi peninsula. Those are old kingdoms at this point. Africa has Egypt and Libya. The Near East has Palestine, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. The Far East has Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Southeast Asia has Indonesia. So those are our Muslim states post-World War II. I mentioned the Arab League. However, the earliest post-war attempt to unite the Muslims across the globe is the World Muslim Congress. And there's a movement that begins called Pan-Islamism, which is an attempt to unite Muslims around the world into a single organization. There's been 3 organizations that have developed over time. The current one is next to the United Nations itself, is the largest international organization in the world. So it's big. I have a little footnote on this. Top of page 53, or at the footnote at the bottom of page 53. The World Muslim Congress began in Pakistan in 1949. The World Muslim League in Mecca superseded it in 1970, and then started earlier but would later succeed it in Saudi Arabia, the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, has 57 member states and is largest next to the United Nations, and that's led by Saudi Arabia. So there's a definite political effort to unite Muslim states across the globe. Now, in the next section here, we talk a little bit about the Cold War and how it plays out. And usually we think of Vietnam and Korea, and of course I'll mention those things in passing, but it really does begin in Turkey. And so we'll start there and talk about how this impacts the Muslim people. But let me pause, as I do every time I get through a section, and see if there's any thoughts or comments about these. Pan just means all or every. So these pan-Islamic organizations, kind of like the United Nations, are attempts currently led by Saudi Arabia to create political cooperation among Muslim states across the whole world. Now, this information I have in this lesson's a little old, but when I wrote it, it was about 57 members. I could look it up on my phone. Yeah.
For most Americans, the Cold War was largely between the Soviet Union and the United States.
Yeah.
And what was happening in the Muslim world was pretty much under the radar for most people. They didn't know much about it. They didn't hear much about it. Why do you think, I don't know, why do you think that was? Why was there such a lack of awareness until probably 9/11? There was a bunch of awareness.
Yeah, I mean, I'll toss a few things off and see what some of you might say about it, because you've grown up with it too. I think fear of nuclear catastrophe certainly put the focus on America and Russia. When I was growing up, whenever I heard about the Third World, all I thought of were hungry kids. Whenever there was any discussion of the Third World, it was always, sending food to starving people in some part of the world. China, Ethiopia, or and a lot of these early Muslim states didn't seem particularly powerful. Saudi Arabia was, but the Saudis were our allies. It comes more into the news, I think, when Iran comes to power and becomes an aggressive force that is not an ally. And so then that was around the time I was born. That was during the Carter days, I think. I don't know. Anybody else have a sense for that? Those are a few things off the top of my head. So I'm talking about things that happened before I was born. So
I always heard about it on the news, but it never made any sense to me, so I couldn't wrap my head around it. And I just said, there's crazy stuff going on, and I don't get it.
that's how a lot of the young people I talk with at the school, somebody blew up somebody in the Middle East somewhere. Right. And they're so used to hearing that they just tune it out, because they know there's a lot of people that don't like each other over there for some reason, but they don't know why.
It's never stated why. There's never
No.
a reason why.
Well, in America right now, we have a kind of everything's about race and economics. And so everything is sort of shoehorned into this theory that if one mosque blows up a church, that there's some sort of race hatred going on there, or there's some sort of economic inequality. And I think that's just false. But that's for me a lazy explanation that isn't really informed by very much history. It's just say, well, people, they hate members of other races, and they're jealous of their money, and there's some kind of injustice going on. It's just a very lazy way of explaining away the problems of other people that we've really never thought about it. We've never read about it. We've never thought about it. So that's what often happens on the news. That irks me because I feel like that's just not true. That's not true. And the idea is that, well, if you get rid of all the racial tension and you flatten out the economy and everybody has enough money, then these problems will vanish. And I think anybody who's got their head screwed on straight knows, well, no, these problems are not going to vanish, even if everybody had all of that.
I think the first time it hit me, I and Pam Gilstead, 25 years ago, were in London,
All right?
and a Muslim woman come up to me, just off the street, and she said, "You American women, you have 1 and 2 children. We're building an army." That was the first time it really hit me that something's going on the radar.
And she meant that in a friendly way.
Oh, yeah, right. It was quite scary. That's true. And then she just turned off and walked away.
Well, that goes back to the moral and spiritual decadence of the West. Even on Darwinian principles, if a civilization cannot reproduce and cannot take care of its children and raise them, and its families fall apart, then that civilization will collapse. You do need families. You need children, and you need children to be raised and to then become citizens. And if a civilization cannot do that, then it will collapse in the face of a civilization that can't. They'll just outbreed you.
Another point is that when Dan and I were coming back from, I don't know where, just within the last 6 months,
From Chicago,
Chicago, we took a,
Amtrak,
huh?
Amtrak.
No,
Well, that's what we.
no, it was you up at the airport, take you where you live in the car.
Limousine.
A taxi, whatever. And he was Muslim, and I asked, still thinking about this Pam Gilstead thing, and I said, "Do you have a big family?" He said, "We all have big families, 8, 7 children."
Yeah.
It was just the way it is. And I thought, yep, here we go. They're breeding us out.
Well, that's a real problem. That's a real problem. Yeah.
You know, Peggy Lewis, there's a little off track that you reminded me of something. I did a lot of business in Asia. After they got comfortable with you, took it to Cologne. They would say brazen things like that. And it's sort of like, I've never had a big brother, but I have a younger brother who was always envied me and always wanted what I had and was willing to do pretty much anything to get it. And it was sort of that way. They'd say brazenly, like, we're going to take you over. We're going to take over the automotive industry. Here's our plan. So when we're in, like Muslims and people in the Far East, they have a plan, they have a long-term plan, and they're working it. And I unfortunately agree with Chester Pad over here. That,
That's what my kids call me. Chester Pad.
yeah, the moral, I'm not a Christian nationalist, but I think the moral decadence of the West is undermining things, and we are going to be vulnerable, not you and me, but grandkids. You and I will be long gone with it.
Yeah, well, in order to create institutions or churches or families that last, you need individuals who will sacrifice their own self-interest for the good of things that outlast them. And if we as a people become so self-focused that everything's about my happiness, and I can't sacrifice for my kids, I can't sacrifice for my business, I can't sacrifice for my church, well then, of course, there's no glue that holds one generation onto the next. And one thing is certainly true, whatever one thinks of Islam, is that like a number of other very conservative religious groups, they have very strong familial values. They have, and those are very, very powerful, and those create bonds that last over generations. Some Christians do too, but it's not as prominent within Christianity as it once was. Christians are struggling with that, and even Christians have, I feel sometimes have, how would I put it? Well, you get the idea. It'll come to me. So on page 53, we'll come back to this here. Turkey, the former heartland of the Ottoman Empire, is where, in some ways, the early events of the Cold War begin. Last full paragraph, page 53. The USSR tries to expand its influence from Turkey into Greece, and from there into the rest of Europe. Turkey refuses to let the USSR establish a base on its coast, and its refusal was met with military and economic assistance from the U.S. So that's how the Cold War works. The U.S. and Russia are playing this game with smaller countries as sort of little proxy wars. Smaller countries are the pawns in this game, and Turkey is one of the first. Turkey's a major Muslim country. President Truman begins his famous Truman Doctrine, which is that the West needs to maintain peace by supporting free people resisting subjugation. And that begins in Turkey. So, that's just kind of interesting there. Turkey is kind of the first place where the Cold War conflict emerges, and it's in a Muslim country. Top of page 54. Other attempts to contain, I think it's at the language, containment of communism. Follow its absorption. Communists absorbed Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. Berlin is divided in 1948. But then it spills over into the rest of the Third World. So I'm going to say a little bit about Arabia, Egypt, and especially the Middle East, where the conflict is currently going on, continuing right now. Arabia remains an ally of the U.S. It sells oil in exchange for the protection of their royal family. And since it's a monarchy, it doesn't have to take a position on democracy versus communism, because it's an old world monarchy. So Arabia, one advantage of having an old system of government like that is they don't have a dog in the fight between the communists and the Democrats. Egypt, they are struggling. There is a potential overthrow of the government by the Muslim Brotherhood. Politician jailed many of the members of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he is assassinated. And then there is a battle for the control of the Egyptian government, which then becomes socialist under al-Nasser. And so Egypt becomes an ally of the Soviet Union. So that, and a lot of problems are going to come up in Egypt from that point forward, because Egypt is now a site of conflict between the East and the West. And, of course, in the Levant, the Holy Land, this partitioning up of the country, of the land into two states. Israel has the support of the United States. Palestine has the support of the USSR. This region saw new uprisings during each of the 5 waves of immigrant Jews, even before it was officially divided up. In 1948, the Arab-Israeli War is the first of many that have continued to break out up to the present day. Israel stood opposed to the combined forces of Palestine, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. All of those countries joined to try to get Israel out. The Jews won, and not only assumed control of the territory initially that they got from the UN, but over half of the territory that the UN had allotted to Palestine. So Israel expands at this point, and Palestine shrinks. Gaza Strip is occupied by Egypt. The West Bank is occupied by Jordan. And note land is left with which to create a state for the Palestinians, which is what the UN had tried to do. Many leave as refugees. The next 50 years would see 4 more bloody wars. And I could, if I were to rewrite this, I would say 5. Because we are in the middle of yet another. Let me stop there and see if there's any questions before we get to the next section, which I hope to get through, and then we'll close out. But kind of see that Arabia is insulated from the Cold War because it's a monarchy. Egypt goes over to the communist side, so Egypt is going to be a site of conflict between the U.S. and the Soviets. And the Jews and the Palestinians begin to fight. And the Jews will consistently win these wars for the most part. And each time they do, they will expand a little bit more and squeeze Palestine out a little bit more. And a number of organizations to get rid of the Jews altogether begin to mushroom up then behind the scenes.
It always seems like the Palestine or the Palestinians, it always seems like they don't want to fight, but it's the people that are over their head that are like the people that are backing them up are the ones that are pushing them to.
Yeah, I guess a couple things I'd say, and one that you just mentioned there is that the interest in getting Israel out of the Middle East is not an isolated Palestinian interest. It's the whole Muslim world that wants them out. And so this isn't just a local conflict between 2 states who can't get along. And that's how it appears in a lot of even the news programs, even right now. It's just sort of a local conflict between 2 states. Thinking, no, I don't think so. Palestine, even at present, is caught in the crossfire between the interests, particularly of Iran, I think, and a number of other Muslim states that are using them to get Israel out. A second thing to bear in mind is that this isn't really a genocide, even though a lot of people are dying. The point is to cause Israel to cease to exist as a state, as a political entity. They don't want Israel to have its own state. For a long time, Jews, there were acts of violence throughout the Middle Ages, but Jews and Muslims did live in the same territories without constant conflict, as long as Jews were second-class citizens. As long as they were under Muslim domination, then they were, so there was no attempt to exterminate them. At certain points in history, there have been attempts to exterminate them, sure. So I think there's a lot of confusion about that. I see it in the news and stuff, and I don't really go in to straighten everybody else out, but this is not just a war between Hamas and Israel. There are a lot of other Palestinian states, Muslim states involved. And as we said, there are over 50 Muslim states. There's only one state of Israel. If the state of Israel falls, the Jews will have no state anywhere in the world.
I mean, even Hamas, though, isn't Hamas, is Hamas, it's almost like Hamas is the warrior version of Palestinian, but it seems like the average Palestinian is just like, I don't want a war, I don't want to fight it. I could be wrong, but it just seems like the Palestinians are just okay, just being who they are. It's
Well, that is true too. What Hamas is doing and what the Palestinian people are doing are not exactly the same thing. Some of what's going on in Hamas is not terribly different than what we'll talk about in a moment with Vietnam. Many of them are being directly put in the line of fire in order to break down the morale of their opponents.
There's also a battle over history in some of this. It's a fairly widely held opinion in Islam that the Jews never really had a kingdom.
Oh, yeah.
That David never took Jerusalem and all that stuff. They say, well, that is mythological, and it enters into the world of archaeology. You've got the Israel Antiquities Authority and the Israeli side, and you have Jordanian and archaeology on the other side of the river, and they're telling two different historical stories, at least some of them are, about history. So history is under revision by a group.
Now, that's interesting. I assume most of you don't spend your weekends reading archaeology. And we might think, well, in academia, see, there people are objective, and they follow the evidence where it leads. But politics gets involved. To my mind, there is no question that ancient Israel was there historically long before Islam even existed. But among archaeologists, there have been attempts, and they continue, to interpret the evidence in such a way as to suggest that there was never any state in ancient Israel going back to the time of, David, Saul, or Solomon. Now, I think that's a silly view, but that they bring all of their scholarly apparatus and learning, in many cases, to try to revise that perception of history. Gary, and then, sure.
I had heard this one scholar talking to this archaeologist saying that what was going on is that they had actually kind of like prevented anyone from doing archaeological research to the temple mount because they're afraid that, we're going to find these ancient Jewish artifacts that prove the Jews really were here.
There's no archaeological work on the Temple Mount. They're working on the Hill of Ophel, which is just below it, and on the ridge that's on the east. But you start digging into that Temple Mount, your lifespan's going to be short-lived. They'll wipe you out. They don't want anybody digging up there.
Is it because it's holy ground, or is it because they don't want to?
Ostensibly because it's holy ground.
But you think
But underneath that,
it's really
there's a real fear that they might actually find something.
It's bold.
Yeah.
It's built very strong.
And it's not just they don't let, other archaeologists, they don't even let their own archaeologists work. Nobody's doing any archaeological work there.
No, that's very, very true. Sharon, you had something.
Israel is a country, and that has a legal status as a country. Can you give me your legal definition for what you are referring to when you say the state of Israel and the state of Palestine? And how do those legal definitions match up with the legal definition of what is a country? And because it sounds like Israel and Palestine almost sound pretty legal when you talk about the state of Israel and the state of Palestine. So legally, where are they?
Well, I don't know how competent I am to go into how deep I can go. My understanding, and I think we talked about a little bit this last week, is that after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the idea was to take the Levant, and that's a geographical region, and carve it up into two separate states. And by states, that means legally independent governments that have legal recognition from the UN and other surrounding states. That doesn't happen, of course, until 1948, with the creation of Israel as an independent region with its own government, and then Palestine as an independent region with its own government.
In Palestine, did they get legal status?
From the UN? Well, before I answer that, what do you think? Do you think that they did?
Do I think that?
Yeah, do you think Palestine got legal status from the UN?
My thought is that.
Yeah, that's, I want to.
I'm not a historical expert either.
No, I'm not either.
My thought is that the Jews came in and nixed all of that business because they just took the land. And they are a country, they are a recognized country now. And
I think if I'm reading you right, my impression is that what happened is that the state of Palestine existed de jure on paper, but after the outbreak of the war, Israel took over an incredible amount of the territory that was initially allotted to them, and that it has never fully existed de facto as the UN intended it to. And that, of course, is what has fueled a lot of the attempts by other Muslim states to resist Israel and try to oust Israel from the Levant. So that's about as far as I'll go with it. I'll say that Palestine exists as a state. The legal terminology is de jure on paper. It began with the Balfour Declaration, and then the declaration of the two-state partitioning of the Levant.
So that's
World War I.
Okay, so that is a legal document that does define a legal state for Palestine?
Well, I'm not even gonna shoot from the hip on that one. What I'll say is, let me put a pin in it. What movie is that from? Let me put a pin in it and come back to it, because your question is a little more technical. I'm talking about some broad historical movements and things here, and on a question that's that technical warrants caution. So I'll be cautious about it. A few other things, and then I might actually get us up, who knows, to my birthday here. On page 54, I mention a little bit 1948 to 1979. Those are the years that this sort of section takes place in. So I was born in 77. Civil War, 1949, the spread of communism in the Orient kicks off the Korean War, which I didn't know anything about growing up, though I did watch MASH from time to time. And I even had some MASH action figures. I still like MASH, actually. Anybody in here like MASH? It's awfully funny.
And the series is better than the movie. So.
Of course, then it spills over into Southeast Asia. Many of you probably know that the Indochina conflict certainly is much older than America's involvement in the 60s. It begins very, very early with French occupation in Indochina. And America gets involved, really, there's some hint of it in the Eisenhower administration, more direct involvement in the Kennedy administration, and then full-fledged involvement during the time of LBJ. But top of page 55, I mention the first Indochina War, 1946 to 1954. Southeast Asia is currently divided into Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam after World War II. That was under, as I said, the power of the French, but they were resisted by the communist dictator Ho Chi Minh. The U.S. did not want to escalate the war by sending troops, but they did send advisors, money, and weaponry, notably napalm, to help out. So we can say that America was involved in that part of the world right from the beginning, in some capacity, right after World War II. The Second Indochina War is what we usually call Vietnam. But Indonesia is a Muslim and largely a secular democracy at this point, and so they don't get embroiled in it. After Eisenhower becomes president, replacing Truman, Khrushchev is in the USSR and getting rid of Stalin is going to change the Soviet policy considerably. The U.S. tries to reduce its expenditure on the military, and the Soviets try to de-Stalinize, all beginning about 1953. In the Middle East, while all of this is going on, and that's usually the news that we always hear about, we don't focus too much on the third world, it's always the U.S. and Russia, U.S. and the Soviets. In the Middle East, a more materialistic incentive for containing communism is to protect oil interests from being taken over by the Soviets. Prime Minister of Iran wants to nationalize the oil industry, which would mean taking it away from Britain. And that becomes a huge issue in Iran. And we have, I mentioned here, a propaganda campaign to secure his removal called Operation Ajax, run by the British Secret Service and the CIA. Sort of James Bond kind of stuff. And I do mention that is the year that the first James Bond book comes out, Casino Royale in 1953. That basically means, though, that Iran has a puppet government set up by the British to maintain control of the oil reserves, and that is going to create the atmosphere in which forces that want to remove Western influence in Iran will erupt. 1979 with the Iranian Revolution. So this is a ways back, but essentially Iran is is only nominally independent. It's still being run by foreign powers, and that's going to create a tremendous dissatisfaction. And so when finally it does become not only nominally independent, but controls its own oil reserves and its own government back in 79, that's going to be a big deal. And unlike the Saudis, Iran has no loyalty to the West and will become a definite enemy of the West from that point forward. So that is sort of a small section on page 55, but I think that's pretty important. Meanwhile, in Egypt, he wants to nationalize the Canal of Egypt, and that means taking the Suez Canal away from Britain, and Britain doesn't want that either. So Britain has an oil interest. They also have the canal that they're interested in. Here, Israel, France, and Britain in 1956 invade. This is opposed by the Muslims, more important by the U.S., and they kind of use economic sanctions, and that actually helps Egypt resist the invasion. That's one of the first examples of America sort of flexing its post-war power in the Suez Canal crisis. Now, I mentioned at the top of page 56, and this is probably close to where I want to get today. That Suez crisis was a big, big deal. Suggested to a lot of Muslim nations that if they wanted to be free and independent, then the U.S. and other powers would help them. So, the number of Muslim countries in the wake of that crisis doubles, from going from 15 to 30. Increasing number of Muslim nations coordinate to do oil production that is enabling them to become wealthy and powerful and exercise a little bit of influence on international affairs. Quite a few new nations align themselves with communism, mostly as a reaction against the French and the British. Now that the French and the British are out, they align themselves with the enemies of the French and the British, which are communist. And that was true of Ho Chi Minh, even in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh flip-flopped in terms of the sort of government that he supported over the course of his career. Socialism spreads from Egypt to Syria to Iraq during this time period. In the Far East, well, I won't talk about the Far East. We got the Viet Cong and the island of Cuba and those kinds of things. But during the Kennedy administration, a few things I want to mention, and then we'll kind of close with this, that sort of set the stage for the big events that come up during my lifetime. OPEC, footnote 79. The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries coordinates the reserves of the 5 biggest oil-producing countries in the world. That's in 1960. Those countries are Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Venezuela. I think if you think about the history of conflict in my lifetime, these countries are not insignificant. Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Venezuela. That's where a lot of the conflict has happened. They were soon joined by other countries, who I mention here. The power to determine the price of oil passes from various companies controlled by America to OPEC. This allows colonized countries to increase their wealth and, again, become a force in international politics. And in some ways, you can see that the Muslim splinter states that were so helpless and poor and in such a difficult condition after the First and Second World Wars are becoming powerful again. They're becoming wealthy, and they're able to actually make things happen on the international scale. A lot of the other stuff there I'll probably begin our class with next week, because I got some stuff about the Bay of Pigs invasion and what else do I got here? The Cuban Revolution. Actually, Fidel Castro didn't die that long ago. What year did he die? Was it just a few years ago, I think?
2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, I remember seeing it on the news. All of that has to do more with the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but I think probably if there's a big-scale picture, and then I'll see if there's any questions about that, these up-and-coming Muslim states are growing in number, they're growing in power and wealth, and the battle between the U.S. and the Soviets is enabling them to, they're able to use that. They're able to use that to their own advantage. And so what's going on in the third world, as you mentioned at the beginning of class, many of us grew up where that wasn't really much talked about or even thought to be a thing. But very powerful forces have been growing in the third world for most of our lifetimes, whether we realized it or not, or whether the people in the news thought that they were important. And so the forces that we see in the world today, they didn't crop up overnight. They've been building for a long, long time. Let's see if there's any. That's a good way to sort of tie it all together, because I know so many dates and details and organizations and states. It's a lot of information. But that, I think, is sort of the big idea here. What do you think? Travis, if I gave a title today's class, what should today's class be entitled? I'm open to suggestions. That's boring. Post-war, that sounds like something I'd come up with. Post. Yeah, I know I did. World War II and after. That doesn't sound interesting either. But go ahead and put it down.
Beyond. World War II and beyond.
Oh, there you go. I like beyond. That sounds like Buzz Lightyear. There you go.
How about how Islam spread across the world in the last 100 years?
Oh, yes. That's not a bad one.
And I will read you out. There you go.
I will breed you out. Now that'll get clicks. That'll get clicks.
What about The Empire Strikes Back?
Oh, that's a good one. All right. I'm going to let you go. Thank you. We're all done here.